So, as somebody with an avid interest in Canada, given the fact that my wife is Canadian, I wanted to review with you and react to Jordan Peterson reading his essay about the sorry state of affairs in Canada regarding Justin Trudeau, the Liberals, and how we've become full totalitarian. I'm going to interrupt as few times as possible, but when needed, definitely. So here we go. Enjoy Dr. Peterson.
I've had the great privilege of traveling to 40 American cities in just about as many states and to 15 European countries in the last 4 months. In the waning days of the great COVID panic, and I've learned many things about our great and self-conscious nation. First, I have not traveled anywhere else where the citizens and the government are more neurotically and fascistically concerned about the pandemic. It may have escaped Canadians' notice, but virtually nowhere else in the civilized world is it now required to wear a mask, as it is still mandatory, damn us, in Canada's airports and on flights out of our benighted country. There is absolutely no excuse for this, except the punitive and appalling self-righteousness of the Trudeau Liberals.
Yeah. Until recently, Canadians who were unvaccinated were not even allowed to leave the nation. Talk about punitive, because if you really thought that these people were a danger to society, wouldn't you want them gone and out of your hair? It's like, oh, I get the opportunity to deport all the drug dealers and Antifa, and I want to make them pay by keeping them within the boundaries of the country. It's punitive. That's all it is.
What else might you expect, however, from a government that also includes Chrystia Freeland, a deputy prime minister, who has literally bragged about her colleagues' appalling performance on the economic front, claiming that it is actually good and meet for Canadians to empty their wallets at the gas pumps so that the climate emergency, which simply does not exist, see Bjorn Lomborg's expert analysis, stays first and foremost in their all too careless, by liberal standards, consciences. I simply cannot believe that this absolute failure of economic policy is now being trumpeted as a positive accomplishment. How daring, how appalling, how manipulative, how miraculous. Here's a hint for you saintly progressives. If you cared about the poor at all, the real poor, not the hypothetical poor you are hypothetically saving in the future, you would do virtually nothing but expend effort to drive down the cost of energy. Energy, which is precisely equivalent to work, and therefore to the wealth that ameliorates poverty.
You are sacrificing at the altar of progressivism the future hypothetical poor against today's. So you are sacrificing the present for a potential future. And given the number of predictions that they've made and lies that they've told regarding COVID, regarding the vaccine, regarding everything, why should we believe them? And having it is almost what he said about Cynthia Freeland and wanting everybody to remember the price of gas so that it weighs upon them. I mean, talk about your aristocracy, talk about your elitist tone that you are taking towards the poor of today and saying you're not good enough. Bow your head as thee have sinned, and you must sacrifice your pleasures because we know-it-alls know what's best for you and for the future.
Second, it is almost impossible to overstate the degree to which Canada's international reputation has been damaged by the childish and ill-advised actions of our juvenile WEF marionette of a prime minister. The Americans I have talked to and with, including people very well placed politically on the Democratic and Republican front alike, listen in open-mouthed and disbelieving amazement when I recount the claim brought forth by the Trudeau Liberals and their hired Canadian Broadcasting Corporation bootlickers that the trucker freedom convoy was financed by Americans hell-bent on bringing about a January 6th style insurrection in Ottawa. Who would benefit from that? Even in principle. Even if the American Republican MAGA types, say, cared about us, which they don't, why in the world would they want to destabilize Canadian democracy? What's the motive to justify the crime? There is none. Period. Do you understand, Canadians? Even the American Democrats think that idea is insane. And a non-trivial proportion of Canadians seemed willing to buy the story, despite its demonstrable, factual falseness.
Something that I don't think that Peterson has mentioned is the fact that the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, or as he calls it, the CBC, is funded by the Canadian government, by Turdeau and his cronies. And they upped the amount this year, so their paycheck is coming from the likes of Justin.
Remember the CBC retraction? Buried in obscurity? And preposterousness. Because the alternative was the truly painful realization that the governmental institutions and the legacy media organizations that served us well and faithfully in the center and on the left and right for 150 years have now become fundamentally incompetent, untrustworthy, self-serving, collusionist, and corrupt. It's easier for too many smug and blind Northerners to swallow the line instead that madmen, MAGA Trumpists want to destabilize what is, after all, their biggest trading partner and most stable and reliable ally. To believe that Confederate admiring truckers, and is there more than a single one of those, are working in concert with the evil orange-haired demon who once ruled the US. And even worse, is Prime Minister Trudeau so daft and deluded that he failed to notice that these same MAGA terrorists are going to utterly shellac the hapless Democrats this coming fall and take the presidency in 2024?
I am Kamala Harris. My pronouns are she and her. I am a woman sitting at the table wearing a blue suit.
And that we will then have to talk, trade, and otherwise consort with them, as they are the perennial elephant on our doorstep. And that burning all bridges in that direction with casual derogation and outright lies might not be particularly politic? And the unfortunate answer to that question is clearly, yes, the Honorable Mr. Trudeau is precisely that pretentious, presumptuous, careless, uninformed, daft, and deluded. But after all, in his own words, he doesn't bother himself with such trivialities as, quote, monetary policy.
That is exactly why you don't hire somebody based on their looks in Trudeau's case and his name, which is essentially a form of affirmative action, similar to how the Americans have Kamala Harris a heartbeat away from the presidency, and she's going to be instituted into that office shortly.
My pronouns are she and her. I am a woman sitting at the table wearing a blue suit.
He does not concern himself with monetary policy because he's incapable of understanding it. And anybody that doesn't understand it, that hasn't had to make it on their own, that hasn't had to sign checks over and manage the books of a business has no business in charge of a government in deciding how money is spent.
Third, on the international front, I have had extensive discussions with political and cultural figures in the UK, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Romania, Hungary, Estonia, Albania, Austria, Croatia, Slovenia, Poland, and Serbia. And I know for a fact, from first-hand communication, that Canada has hurt itself very badly on the reputational front with the derisive dismissal of the trucker convoy, which has spawned similar movements in other countries, most notably the US and the Netherlands, with the imposition of the Emergencies Act, and most signally, with the seizure of private bank accounts without due process or any pesky process at all.
Absolutely.
Perhaps Canadians are trying to downplay the significance of all of this because we are in some state of shock after all the COVID authoritarianism, which we have not yet sloughed off.
I told you, my wife is Canadian and I had a Canadian bank account. And after Turdeau froze the bank accounts of the truckers, attempted to seize the funds that were donated to them and vilified them, I withdrew my money, which I hadn't touched in that account since 2000 and something, 2015 or something like that. It was just sitting there for that amount of time. I got it out of there immediately. And I will no longer do business with Canada because I don't trust their private property rights. So that negatively affects banks' earnings at US because it's deposited now in the US and maybe into Bitcoin. So I've taken my money out of the financial legacy system, and that does negatively impact Canada. And nor will I ever do business in Canada again. I simply will not. So for you Canadians watching out there, it does have real effects, as Dr. Peterson is stating.
Oh, and on that note, I have not seen people anywhere in all my travels more terrified by their government than Torontonians, except perhaps in Vancouver. And this includes the denizens of the almost equally woke as Canada states of New York and California. Everyone outside is asking, just what in hell is going on in the great white north? And not without true sorrow. Our country was for many years, despite its rather small population and its general insignificance in the larger scheme of things, a beacon of both possibility and stability.
Was
a remarkable example of what a tolerant modern democracy might be. A place where people from multiple cultures could thrive, and a staid, sober, but also sporadically interesting and creative place. And now, we're shell-shocked sheep ruled by a poser with the maturity of a teenager and the temperament of a Hollywood D-list celebrity. And because 3 catastrophes are not enough, here's an additional diverse, to use a hated word, selection, peppered with some questions. How have Canadians failed to realize that our government holds them and our racist country utterly in contempt? That Mr. Trudeau believes that his God-given mission is to elevate the consciousness of his citizens instead of serving their interests economically and practically. That the Trudeau Liberals are perfectly willing to make us all poor, miserable, and demoralized, just to utterly fail in his efforts to save the planet. That the agents of that party and government are, as previously noted, perfectly willing and eager to trumpet that aim, which can be easily attained through the wretched combination of incompetence and moral Machiavellianism that characterizes the Trudeauites as a moral accomplishment. That we could be the freest, richest, cleanest country in the world, but that we are trying hard to be none of those 3. that we are dividing ourselves along racial lines that are more germane to the US, just to ape the very progressive radicals whose idiot policies on the American front are dooming the Democrats to what appears to be the worst electoral defeat they have experienced in at least 50 years.
Yeah, it is absolute virtue signaling by the Canadians, who are basically of one skin color, or at least much more so than in the United States. It is posturing to make yourself look good to your fellow progressive, to your fellow man. Oh, look at me. I am holier than thou. I am with you. We are up here. Everybody else is down here. It's pure ego.
That all the data on the environmental front indicates that the fastest way to improve the ecosystems on which we all depend is to make people richer, not poorer, and to do that with good old capitalism. So they have the luxury to think about the long run and the habitat of their children. And I have, as of yet, said nothing about additional issues, such as Bill C-11, which is perhaps the most appalling piece of legislation currently on the books. And that's a tough competition on the Canadian scene right now, which renders virtually every internet content provider in the world subject to the rules that should not even still govern the CBC and CTV, despite their use of scarce public airwaves, and which will make the rules regulating the net in Canada the most absurd and restrictive in the free and perhaps the unfree world. Or the appalling fact of the massive and continuing subsidization of the rapidly failing legacy media. Are you listening, CBC executives? By a government that only requires that the recipients of that largesse parrot back every foolish falsehood and lie uttered by the mad executive branch of our reprehensible government. Or the fact that because of COVID, WTF, really? Parliament has essentially been suspended for yet another year. Or that we are pursuing an energy policy generated by low-resolution thinking, Marxism-addled ideologues that will not only impoverish our populace by making energy unreasonably expensive. Have you noticed, Canadians, when you fill up your unnecessary vehicles at the pump? But that will only increase the probability that countries such as China will have to rely on coal to produce electricity instead of accessing, say, our plentiful natural gas. And that will therefore make the carbon dioxide burden borne by the atmosphere greater instead of lesser. And just last week, and in the aftermath of the Dutch farmer protests, that we are trying to reduce the absolute levels of the greenhouse gas nitrous oxide produced by those who grow our crops. That's food, folks. Regardless of the amount of those crops produced in consequence. And we're doing that by threat and force. Shades of COVID policy.
Again, you're not taking into account the secondary effects. You want to clean up all the dirt out of the garden because your son got dirty the other day, and suddenly you can grow no roses, no food, no nothing. Nothing can survive. It's the stupidity of these leftists that are only looking at the immediate task at hand and to be able to virtue signal without looking down the line and seeing the dominoes and how they will fall.
Instead of working with the farmers to find mutually acceptable and truly sustainable economic and environmental solutions. And that we're pursuing these policies in a world where starvation in the near future in many countries is not only a likelihood, but a virtual certainty. Or the incomprehensible insistence by Jasmit Singh, sworn enemy of the real working man, that the proper role of the socialist NDP is to indefinitely prop up Trudeau's government, despite the fact that there seems to be nothing in it at all for Singh's party. Not even the cabinet position that a competent negotiator could have at least requested as compensation for the sacrifice of his soul. Or the fact that our judiciary must now be staffed by people who must, or else, swear fealty to the DIE ideology that has devastated universities and is now working its way through many blind and careless corporations. That we are, in consequence, producing and permanently instantiating a generation of activist judges who regard as their role not the responsibility of abiding carefully by rule of law and precedent, but usurping what should be legislative action so that they can improve the world more efficiently than mere parliament, with its lack of Chinese Communist Party efficiency, might manage.
He's referencing this clip.
With Sun TV watching for any slip, he was asked which country he most admired and referred to China.
There's a level of admiration I actually have for China, because their basic dictatorship is allowing them to actually turn their economy around on a dime and say, we need to go green as fastest. We need to start, investing in solar.
And again, this is the legislative branch of the US government that I fear, because that's the one thing keeping the progressives and their horrible ideas at bay, is when you have activist judges that don't look at the law and apply the law as written, but rather as what they see to be the best use of their gavel for their own ideological purposes.
Or the fact that the OECD has predicted that Canada will have the worst growth prospects of the major industrial societies for the next 4 decades. Please excuse the elevated voice, but good God. The worst? And for 4 decades? I believe that the federal Liberals have run the most incompetent administration in Canadian history. That they have not yet done all the terrible damage that they are going to do. That Canadians will not wake to the reality of the situation, because an awakening at that level requires a level of conceptual restructuring and consequent emotional trauma that we have never been called on before to manifest. And that Trudeau's idiosyncratic combination of willfully blind ignorance, moral pretension, and narcissistic self-aggrandizement is so toxic that it borders on, if does not cross the line, into outright treason. And the situation with Singh might, if anything, be worse. He is as dangerously incompetent and immaturely narcissistic as Trudeau, without even being simultaneously canny enough to capitalize personally or professionally on his delusional pretensions. Trudeau's government has been racked by scandals, each one severe enough to justify the dissolution of Parliament under normal conditions, so numerous that it is almost impossible to recover from the shock of the presently revealed misbehavior quick enough to process the next. And we could have 4 more years of this, particularly if the damnable Singh continues to ambulate miraculously without a spine, something physiologically impossible, but apparently simultaneously possible on the political and conceptual front. This is not good, Canadians. We not only look like fools to our great American allies and internationally, and the particularly self-righteous fools that only Canadians can be, we are actually being fools, led by the king of fools. And we're going to pay for it. And so are our children and grandchildren. This government has to go, just as the truckers intimated. And the sooner the better. And hopefully, God willing, we'll be fortunate enough to find some competent adults to lead us. Conservatives, do you have it in you? Polyev, Charest, Lewis, Bobber, Aitchison. Can you shake off the mob-generated guilt and consequent moral timidity that has so effectively hamstrung opponents of the pretentious idiot leftist radicals for the last 15 or 40 years, and stand forthrightly for traditional values of family, economy, culture, and indeed environment? Can you serve as genuine guardians of the working and middle class, and rich and successful entrepreneurs and businessmen for that matter, and put forward a positive and attractive vision that's more than mere reaction to the overreach of the utopian left? Conservatives, can you withstand the temptation to destroy your party with internal squabbles, or to settle in September for a candidate that displeases no one but fails to truly satisfy anyone, as you have done much too often in the past? Rough times are coming. What with the cascading consequences of energy shortage, supply chain disruption, war in Ukraine, energy, and last but by no means least, severe and looming food and fertilizer shortage. The Liberals and the NDP are gone into the utopian clouds. I pray we have in Canada something in reserve that is better, although it is truly hard to see how anything different from what we have now could be worse.
There you have it, guys. Dr. Jordan Peterson, and taking down Trudeau, Jasmit Singh, and Canada as a whole. And he's 100% right, as illustrated by the fact that I've withdrawn my bank account, and I'm sure that other people have withdrawn their money as well. Never to do business with Canada again is my statement. The only reason that the Canadian dollar has any value left with somebody that doesn't know monetary policy is the fact that they have so many natural resources and such a small population that they can always sell them off to China, as they are China, for real money, if you want to put it like that. I personally think Bitcoin is a far superior investment than the Canadian dollar, which cannot be debased. But yeah, it's 100% true. There are negative ramifications that are going to come from Canada. You cannot run a government in this manner and expect anything good to happen. So I urge all Canadians to vote for their liberty and vote against Justin Trudeau. Thank you, Dr. Jordan Peterson, for your reading of your brilliant essay. What an eloquent man he is. Please, guys, thumb up the video, subscribe, hit the notification bell, share the video. Peace out.